Arizona Territory, 1881. At first light under the dragoon alpenglow, the percolator gurgled, and the windmill sang its dry whine. Cole Hart poured a second cup of coffee for the empty chair, then noticed a smear of blood by the water trough. Before sundown, 300 Chiricahua riders would close the circle. 1 cup of water set on the ground would decide it, bloodshed or a life spared, and I, the hard-to-please sort, couldn't look away. Part 1. 2 cups of coffee and the empty chair. Warmth before dawn. The percolator bubbled on the cast-iron stove, its glass lid trembling like a familiar nod. The pink alpenglow spilled down the slopes of the dragoons, slipping slowly through the window slats, to rest on the edge of a pine table darkened with oil. Cole Hart fed the fire, tipped the pot, and poured 2 cups, one he kept for himself, the other he set before a chair that hadn't been sat in for a long time. That cup's rim was chipped, exactly where another's mouth used to rest. He turned it toward the stove out of habit, not to see it better, but to keep from having to see it at all. Morning wind curled sagebrush scent into the house, along with caliche dust fine as powdered stone. The windmill in the yard gave a faint, dry metal squeal as its blades turned. Cole hung his coat on a nail, picked up the grease tin, and stepped outside. The sky was still pale, and a few ravens had claimed the old fence post, black as notes on a sheet of lonely music. They called 3 times, then fell silent. He brushed the dust from the windmill shaft, worked grease into the bearing, and spun the blades. The paddles changed tone, turning smoother. On the tack room sill, the saddle left overnight still held the warm smell of horse. He took an oiled rag to the bit ring until it caught the light, his fingers stopping at an old crack near the steel, one that had carried him through 2 drought seasons and still hadn't given. Cole ran his palm over the saddle's face, hearing the leather answer back, a sound that told a man he still had work to do, whether life was peaceful or not. Back in the kitchen, he lifted his cup, the bitter, dark coffee mingling with stove smoke. The other cup sat before the empty chair, catching a thin thread of sunlight. His hand faltered slightly on the chipped rim, so slight no one else would notice, like a man brushing a stone from his boot before walking on. Dry as tinder, Rafe Salazar called from the door, squinting toward the horizon. Cole nodded toward the windmill. Rafe understood, circled to the back, his boots knocking dry against the hard-packed ground like mesquite twigs snapping. In the kitchen stillness, Cole put small things in their places. The paring knife in its old groove, the rawhide rope coiled tight, the silver concho that had fallen from a lead rope long ago, now rolled into a corner. He picked it up, blew off the dust, and dropped it in his pocket. Such things meant little on their own, but out here a man's hands were rarely empty. He topped the copper kettle with warm water and set it on the stove's edge, as if someone might walk in one day, cough softly, hold cold hands to its sides, and smile. The wind shifted, bringing a new scent, metallic salt beneath the grass. Blood. Cole stopped, tilting his head. Not the steel of a saddle, not the rust of a hinge. It came from the water trough. He stood still for a moment, listening the way one listens for a newborn calf's breath, because if it stumbles, the whole barn knows. On the sill, the chipped tin cup caught another shard of light, its bowl warming, steam curling like a breath. The walk from kitchen to yard wasn't far, but some mornings that stretch felt like the slope a man must climb before the day can truly start. Cole set his cup down, pulled on his hat and gloves, unhurried. Out here, haste was a sign a man had forgotten what the land teaches. He moved along the fence line, boots crunching on caliche, eyes scanning each wire, each post he'd set with his own hands, every crooked one a sweat-stained memory, Ravens shifted perches, their beaks tapping the wood like pestles on grain. The windmill slowed with the easing wind, its squeal stretching into a thin line through the air. Rafe passed by, handing him the gate lock, then moved on. No words. People here pointed with their actions. Cole paused when his shadow fell across the sand, remembering it was the day he usually packed salt for the cattle in the lower pasture, a habit kept without reminder. His hand touched the concho in his pocket, mind flashing to a far-off scene. A red-wind afternoon, a quiet laugh from the kitchen table, a hand setting a coffee cup in front of him, a short, warm sentence. The memory passed like cloud shadow, just long enough to remind him a man can live on small things. The water trough stood under the windmill's shade. The water was clear, but along the wooden lip ran a dark brown streak, as if someone had written a short sentence in the sand and tried to wipe it away with a palm. Cole bent close. The scent of blood was stronger here, faint but enough to tell a man to stop and look closer. He drew out a handkerchief, wiped along the edge. The streak didn't vanish, only lightened, revealing a fresh hairline scratch on the rim. A gust bent the yucca leaves, fence wire rings jingling against the post. His palm rested on the cool wood, feeling the faint shiver of water as the windmill poured in, another thin stream. No fresh hoofprints, only a few grains of sand in a curved pattern. Something had been dragged. He straightened, eyes following the curve until it lost itself in the grass. Inside, the percolator's rhythm changed, telling him the fire had eased. Somewhere far off, a bridle jingled, just once, enough to let him know the morning had shifted. He turned back, quietly gathering what his hands would need. The belt knife, the rawhide rope, the silver concho. The chipped cup still sat on the sill, bright in the sun. He lifted it a moment, then set it down again, turning the flaw toward the stove as before. Some things need saying, but out here people start with water. He looked toward the trough, his gloved fingers tightening. The windmill took one more turn, the squeals suddenly fine and thin, like the sigh of someone who'd just stopped trying. At the water's edge, the dark stain still lay there, thicker now in the rising light. It sat like a half-read sentence pulling the eye down a narrow trail that led out of the yard. One step down which would change the shape of peace. Part 2. The Girl in the Red Dust. The Cuts and the Charm Bag. Beyond the trough, where the caliche soil cracked into thin flakes, red dust lay in smudges like powdered rouge. A body was curled beside the fence, half in the windmill's shadow, half in the young sun. Her hair clumped in mats, dried blood tangled with dust like thorny thread. Her dress was torn, the hem ripped straight through, old stitches bursting to show pale new skin. Her left foot was bare, heel split, her ankle marked by a cord. Cole stopped a yard away. Borderland instinct held a man still before any move. He set his rifle on the barn sill, the barrel lying flat, muzzle turned toward the wall, a sign of no quarrel. In the trough, the water quivered under the wind's turn of the blades. Sunlight broke in shards on the small ripples, dappling her cheek. He knelt, calloused fingers finding the pulse at her throat. It was there, thin as thread now, and gone. Breath came in short bursts, carrying the scent of hot sand. Near her chest hung a small leather bag on a thin cord, clicking against her collarbone with each breath. Cole lifted it gently, without untying, just enough to glimpse dry sage leaf and a piece of black obsidian, its sharp edge flashing cold blue. She held it as if holding the road home. Rafe appeared behind, his shadow long across the dirt, carrying a basin of water. He set it down near the rail, eyes scanning the ground for tracks. "Ain't pretty." Cole didn't look up. "Water before words." Rafe understood, stepped back, leaving space for the two of them. Cole dripped a little water onto her cracked lips. A drop slid along a fissure. Her hand trembled, faint as a body not yet convinced good things still happened. He eased the cloth edge between her lips, wetting them again. When her breath slowed, he unstoppered his whiskey flask, scalded needle and shears, and rinsed the worst gash on her forehead. Warm stove ash mixed with water, he pressed onto small arm cuts to staunch the bleeding, an old dry country trick when medicine was short. The cuts told of a cold, deliberate hand, parallel lines nearly measured by cord, running along the outer left forearm, two shallow, one deep, repeating like a code. Around her wrist, faint black charcoal marks suggested numbers, burned into memory. On her dress belt was a strip of leather, cord-tied, hastily brand-marked. Cole had seen such marks on freight crates through the valley. Lot, route, price, not a hunter's sign, not ceremony, the language of slavers, the kind that spoils a heart's beat. He stitched in short, firm passes, tying square knots. Each pull of the thread was a reminder to keep his hand steady. Let the work do the work, not the anger rising under his ribs. Now and then he set his palm flat on her shoulder, feeling the slight tremor of her body and the breath buried in the windmill's murmur. Rafe circled the barn, gathering stray cloth, wiping the trough's edge, pouring reserve water in. The sound of water on wood was as gentle as a slow-speaking voice. Her ankle marks were fresh. Between bone and tendon the skin was scraped raw, the blood stopped at a deep pink, rope removed not long ago. Her ribs showed bruises shaped like a box edge. The whole body was a map of a forced journey. Cole rolled his sleeves higher, warmed the whiskey flask in a cloth, poured it over the bruise to coax blood flow back. Then he laid a thin blanket over her, pulling it to her chin, leaving the charm bag outside so the cord wouldn't cut her skin. The blood scent thinned in the air, replaced by whiskey vapors and stove smoke clinging to his shirt. Sun climbed the fence line, shrinking the windmill's shadow. Nita shifted faintly. Her hand still held the leather bag, fingers caked with dirt yet careful, like one used to guarding small things from the jolts of hard riding. Cole saw in it a quiet resolve, the kind that carries people through nights longer than gunfire. He guided her inside, laying her on his own bed, pulling a chair to the foot where he could change bandages easily. The chipped tin cup still sat on the sill, bright in the sun. Cole tipped the kettle, letting drops fall to her lips again. Each drop was a bead of time, falling steady, naming life. On the porch, Rafe tied the barn gate firm, stepping lightly to keep the boards from groaning. Passing the kitchen, he glanced at the chipped cup, noting the rim turned stoveward as always. There are ways of keeping memory in its place, so your hands are free for the living. Cole opened the cedar chest under the bed, took out clean bandages, set them neat beside the basin. He rested her arm on a folded shirt as a pillow, slid the needle carefully through thin skin. The thread's whisper was barely there, but a man used to it could hear. By the mattress edge, the branded leather scrap swayed with her breath. The numbers not yet cooled from the iron, edges still powdery. He cut it free, wrapped it in cloth, and pocketed it. Not to keep as proof, but to spare her another touch from it. When the last knot was tied, Cole sat back, listening for her breath to deepen. On the table, the silver concho from earlier lay beside the paring knife, catching a sliver of light. He set his hand on the bed frame, not on her skin, like placing a silent promise. From far off, through the plank walls, bridal metal rang, once, twice, 3 times, like scattered raindrops gathering clouds. He didn't need to look to know the morning had shifted again. The windmill still turned, water still ran, but something larger was moving toward the ranch, slow and unstoppable. Nita stirred, eyelids fluttering like wet butterfly wings. Her hand eased on the charm bag, just for a breath, then tightened again. Cole poured another drop, tilted the cup until water touched her lips. Her breathing settled to an even rhythm. In that exact moment, suspicion seeped from the room, like damp drawn from sun-warmed boards, leaving a different quiet, gratitude that didn't need words, the kind that a set-out cup of water could carry. Outside, the bridle rang again, longer, metal striking metal like a signal. Cole looked to the porch, where his rifle still lay flat on the sill, knowing the ritual of water before words was about to be repeated. This time, not just for one. Part 3. Dawn with many footsteps. The closing arc. The sky rose to a pale pink tear, alpenglow, spilling across the edge of the dragoons, stretching the yucca shadows, long like fingers pointing toward the valley. The early wind thinned, replaced by the clean chill of a new day. In the yard, the windmill still turned with its dry, low metallic tone. Inside, steam from the copper kettle unwound into a fine ribbon. Cole stood for a long beat at the doorway, then drew the curtain halfway. Through the slit, the outside world slid in. A line of dust hugging the ground, a scatter of black specks moving slowly, each with its own rhythm, like the heartbeats of a great animal still holding its breath. Horse breath showed before the riders' shapes, white puffs gathering into low clouds, dissolving with the wind. Riders bled gradually out of the chaparral dust, spaced evenly, unhurried, unshowy. They moved like water along the folds of the land, the dark folds of their clothing, swelling and settling. There was no shouting, no wasted motion, only saddles kissing bit rings, soft metallic clicks that came and went like a single raindrop falling and gone. The arc formed slowly, not thick but unbroken. The path from the barn to the valley narrowing like the mouth of a pouch, drawn tight. Rafe ghosted behind Cole. Spurs slipped into his boots, but not latched. He set a bundle of bandages on the table, stood to one side of the doorframe, scanning fence lines, knolls, and the dry wash, where white rock showed like the bones of an old river. In the back room, Nita shifted, her breathing steadier after water. When the distant tack noise stretched into a longer chain, she sat, bolt upright, still gripping the charm bag at her breast. The shadow of a rider passed across a bar of sunlight, and fragments of light struck her eyes. Her mouth was dry, but a name still escaped. Yazzie. Father. The words were thin as thread, yet clear as a carved mark. Cole didn't turn. He kept the curtain as it was, enough to see, not enough to expose himself. On the sill, the rifle lay flat, barrel turned inward as it had since morning. His hand didn't reach for it. Out here, men learned to speak with the least motion. He watched the arc tighten slowly, noting how they anchored themselves into the land. A pair hidden behind Ocotillo, another along the wind-cut edge of sandbank, some holding ridgelines without breaking the skyline. No haste. The patience of people who know they hold the position. The wind shifted. Somewhere far off, a drum sounded, 3 short beats, 1 long, then stopped. A voice just enough to say, "We are here," and near enough. The ravens left the fence post, wheeled once, settled in the wild lilac, and went silent. Cole felt the silence thicken until even the scrape of rawhide rope against wood could be heard. Nita had come to the doorway, legs still trembling but her back straight. She touched the curtain's edge with her fingertips, not drawing it further, only to feel the cloth under her nails. The charm bag clicked lightly against her collarbone, like a bell too small to hear unless close. Rafe stepped back half a pace, leaving the door open just enough for light to reach the porch boards inside. He checked the kettle's hook, lowered the fire so its boil wouldn't drown the sounds outside. The riders now ringed the ranch's outer edge. At the north wall, wind pushed sand into a tiny fan-shaped drift. The valley road had narrowed to a thread, barely enough for a horse to slip sideways through. and any horse taking it would be seen from 4 directions. Cole exhaled short, the breath catching at his throat as if an invisible line stretched across the house, taut enough to remind. Nita tilted her head to listen. In the low woods to the west, a single hoof struck stone, then stopped, a signal. One rider slid out from the line, detaching himself from the arc. No one moved to cover him. They didn't need to. He sat straight in the saddle, shoulders loose, hands not gripping the horn. Catching the wind, his horse stepped slowly, each pace measuring the ground. The lance across his lap lay low, its tip angled aside, not toward the house, showing the opening wasn't made of steel. Cole lowered the curtain a finger's width, narrowing his view to the face just parted from the line. The rider's dark clothing was cut for neither army nor display. A diagonal strap crossed his shoulders, studded with polished bone beads. The wind brought the familiar smell of horse into the house, laced with sun-dried leather and human sweat, the natural scent of long roads. Inside, Rafe set the bandage bundle back on the table, nudged a low stool toward the bed for Nita to sit if needed. He fastened his spurs, then unfastened them again, leaving the straps loose. The faint clink of metal was like a quiet reminder to stay still. The distant drumbeat returned, 3 short, 1 long, then stopped exactly as a hand rose on the ridgeline, palm up to the sky, far enough that no features showed, but near enough for the meaning to be felt. The arc stopped moving, no tighter, no looser. The envoy's horse now stood close enough that its saddle rings could be heard on the porch. On the sill, the chipped tin cup still caught the new sun. Cole glanced at it, then back. Nita stood motionless, eyes fixed on the man riding in. On her wrist, the rope burn had begun to close, a hint of fresh blood rising under the ash. The moment stretched like a cord pulled so tight no one dared breathe hard. Everything in the house lay in its place. Copper kettle low boiling, bandages stacked, silver concho beside the paring knife. Outside, the ring of horses and men was like an old stone circle raised only by presence. The envoy lowered his lance a fraction as he neared. A bow from afar. The drum was silent. The wind stilled. Cole set his hand on the doorframe, feeling the old grain under his palm. He knew water before words would be the first thing offered from this porch. And he knew when an arc closes away but lets one man enter with his lance low, the morning carries not only the threat, but a chance to see how far trust can go before the guns speak. Oh. Part 4. Water before words. The circle at the porch. The man on the ridgeline raised his hand, palm open to the sky, then urged his horse out from the arc. The black horse, head low and mane cropped short, stepped as if measuring the earth. The dark saddle shone with the polish of long, hot miles. The rider dismounted about 10 paces from the porch. He stood straight, both hands empty, shoulders loose, nothing concealed. The first light slid across his sun-browned cheek, mapping the lines of a life lived outside. Every movement was slow, as if the ground itself needed time to learn he brought no harm. Cole opened the door just wide enough for both his and Nita's shadows to spill out. She stood close at his shoulder, a blanket wrapped to her waist, hair roughly combed, a white bandage bright against her brow. She kept the charm bag at her collarbone, fingertip touching it once, checking as if to confirm the road home for her heart. On the porch threshold, the rifle lay flat on the wooden ledge, barrel turned toward the wall, a statement already made. Behind them, the windmill turned with a low, steady squeal, the heartbeat of the house. Cole carried out a water jug and set it on the flat ground between the two sides, mouth upright to the sky, handle turned just so a guest could lift it easily. The surface mirrored a sliver of morning. The man opposite, Chief Yazzie, did not step forward at once. He dipped his head, eyes traveling from the jug to the porch ledge where the rifle lay flat. With the briefest glance, the glance of a man long practiced in reading small signs, he showed he understood the goodwill. No words were needed. He moved forward 2 strides, dropped to one knee, lowering himself to the level of the ground, and to keep dust from the mouth of the jug, lifting it with both hands, he drank. The water slid down his throat like stones rolling in the bed of an old stream. When he finished, he set the jug back exactly where it had been, without shifting it so much as an inch. From his sleeve, he drew a braided loop of horsehair, thick cord, fine tassels, and laid it beside the jug, close enough for the tassels to catch in the water. Sunlight struck the wet strands, making them glint like a promise tied fast. No one explained, but all understood. Off his right shoulder, Taji stood half-turned, eyes fixed on the braid. His fingers rolled a carved bone bead on the cord at his neck, thumb tracing its groove by long habit. The motion slowed when he saw Nita there, white bandage, spine straight. On the left flank, her brother Nantan held his horse back, gaze locked on his sister's face. His hand stroked the horse's muzzle, letting his scent work into its breath, steadying them both. Nita dipped her head slightly, her fingertips brushing the bandage as if to say someone had tended the hurt with clean hands. Then she pointed to the chair where Cole had slept the night before, resting her finger on its back for a brief second, long enough for her father to understand whose bed had been given up. The chief looked at the chair, and his eyes softened like a slow, deep current before he gave a short nod, taking that gesture in. The wind shifted suddenly, lifting dust at the porch steps. On the eastern rise, Jeb Tanner's voice carried like a tin can striking a post. "Call a posse." The words stumbled in the wind, breaking apart, but enough to reach the outer ring. A few horse heads turned slightly. Cole didn't look back. "No need," he said, low enough for the wind to carry, loud enough for the right ears. The chief glanced toward the source of the voice. His left hand rose a fraction, light as setting down a small stone, and the arc out there held its shape, neither pressing in nor loosening. Rafe appeared at the doorway, set a tin cup beside the jug, one hand on the doorframe as if anchoring a moored boat. He said nothing. The chief's eyes touched the chipped rim, then met Cole's. In that look was gratitude spoken entirely in action, and the wariness that is the breath of this land. He brushed a hand lightly over his own saddle horn, as if to remind himself he had drunk here, and that an invisible cord was now tied. Silence stretched, so complete a man could hear sand grains rolling over a boot toe. Nita gripped her charm bag, then let it go as someone learning to trust again, a little at a time. Taji no longer rolled the bone bead. His hand rested near his knife hilt, not gripping, just keeping himself balanced. Nantan eased his horse a half step, blocking the wind from his sister without disturbing the arc. Cole bent to lift the jug, poured a little water into the cup, and set it back exactly as it had been. Everything moved slowly, as if all present knew the land must see certain gestures in the right order to avoid misunderstanding. The chief touched the braid with his forefinger, pushed the wet tassels deeper into the light, so they flared and went dark again. That small motion made Nita exhale more evenly, her gaze leaving the dried blood on her own hand to rest on the ground between them, where water and braid lay together, marking an agreement without paper. On the porch, the windmill turned, its squeal softened as if newly greased. Inside, the copper kettle on the stove took on a rounder, warmer note. Sagebrush scent from the far field rode the back of the wind into the porch. From the road, the faint jingle of metal, not saddle tack but the small clutter of a peddler's pack, approached. Down in the valley, a lone dust plume crept closer, low and steady, not the pace of warriors but of someone used to trade routes. The chief's eyes flicked toward it for a moment, then back to the braid and the water, as if the land itself had just sent the next signal for what should follow this first ritual. Cole set the cup down in its place. Nita pulled her blanket higher, shielding the bandage from the sun. Taji removed his hat, dusting the brim as if easing himself off a knife edge. Nantan gave his sister a small nod, brief but heavy as stone on a riverbank. The chief stepped back half a pace, making room for the jingle to cross into the life of the porch. Water before words were done, and the words, if any, would come when the mingled scents of dust, cinnamon, and sun-cured hide reached the fence line. Part 5. The Wind Brings News from Snake Creek. A map in ash on the boards. The faint jingle grew nearer, not saddle iron, but the metallic knock of goods on a pack frame each time the mule changed step. The packman halted at the edge of the arc, hands open, straw hat brim low. Miguel Ortega. The scent of sun-cured cowhide, mingled with cinnamon and a trace of clove from his cloth bags, the kind of smell that folds itself into a desert morning like a memory of a distant market. Chief Yazzie dipped his head once. A few riders shifted to open a narrow way. Rafe slid the tin cup toward Miguel, water before words, the shortest road into a story. Miguel drank, wiped his mouth with a sun-dark hand, his eyes flicking past the white bandage on Nita's brow to the braided horsehair by the jug. From his woven basket he drew a charred plank scrap, set it on the porch step, scooped a palm of black ash from the stove pan, and dusted it thin. With a stick he sketched quickly a dry arroyo crawling down from the dragoons, caliche outcrop like bone, a standing rock as marker, and a cook tent pitched at the wide bend where Snake Creek hooked sharp. The way in was silent from the south flank, hugging low scrub. Miguel tapped the stick at 3 points, leaving 3 dim circles like coals banked for the night. A handcart rattled from the town side, halted at the sight of the ark. Seamus O'Rourke jumped from the shafts with a tool sack in one arm and a bundle of farrier's nails in the other. He raised his empty hand high, waited for the chief's nod before slipping through, and when his eyes met Nita's, he gave a brief bow. Seamus set the sack on the porch, pulled a hammer, and struck the spine of a bar, 3 blows, then 2, the San Simon Smith's own rhythm. "Need something fixed, I fix it," he said, softer than the windmill's groan, eyes on no one, asking nothing. Miguel handed him a char-edged scrap of hide found near Snake Creek. On it, the blurred brand of some warped iron. Seamus glanced once, tilted it into the sun, sniffed, scraped the seared edge with his thumb, and nodded, a broken stem pay, a cross-stroke like a whip-slash, the mark of Harlan Pike. He tapped hammer to knife hilt in the same 3-2 beats, stamping the truth in sound. The wind lifted dust in a thin ribbon. The chief stepped back half a pace, his hand indicating the ash map. He set his thumb on the arroyo line, slid it down to the bend, and stopped at the cook tent sign. "My people crossed San Simon to dodge patrols, to follow the game," he said slowly. "My child was taken along the way." Nita angled herself to keep sun off her bandage, hand on her charm bag, eyes pinned to the 3 ash dots as if they held the bitterness of the night's past. Nantan edged his horse closer to deepen the shade over her, still rubbing the animal's neck to calm them both. Miguel dug from his basket a bent cage lock, still greasy black, empty now, but the tang of iron clung. He set it at the board's corner beside Snake Creek's ash line. No one touched it. The thing spoke for itself. Wagon with iron bars, planked inside, axle grease on the bolts to make them slide quiet. Rafe bent to the map, dipped a fingertip in ash, and drew a fine cut, in from the south into the camp's edge. A route screened by yucca, wind-tight, Footfall muffled. Beside it he set a short rawhide strip, a note that it would be needed to make the work quiet. Seamus looked over the flats, the pale eyes of an Irishman weathered in sun narrowing. "Pike likes to own the pass," he said to the windmill. "Takes people, runs with liquor freight, buys favors, sets debts." He didn't say Cal Webb's name. The wind finished that sentence. Miguel dropped a few cinnamon sticks in paper on the step, their warm spice rising to sit between the smells of metal and smoke, loosening something drawn taut. Shoulders in the arc eased, as if scent alone could take the chill from a man's back. Cole crouched over the ash map, reading the lines like the veins in a palm of land. He set 2 fingers where Miguel had marked the cook tent, gauged the reach to the rock cut behind. The way out. The sun shifted. The windmill's shadow swept the board like a clock hand. On the porch rail, the chipped tin cup caught a new glint. Beside the jug the braid chief had said earlier was half dry, its damp tassels dust-speckled like a cord stretched between 2 banks of the same thing. The chief studied the map again. Then Cole. His gaze passed the flat-laid rifle, the chipped cup, and settled on the hand holding the drawn line. No speech. He set his calloused palm on the board's edge, pressed a fingertip into the ash, leaving a print, signing with the soil of this place. "My people will go north, make noise," he said, eyes on Cole. "The South needs hands that keep silent, weak ones out first." His voice was thin as the water's lip in a jug, and heavier than the words. Nita looked up. Sunlight caught her eyes, showing not only fatigue but a rawhide strong thread beneath. She touched her bandage, then her charm bag. No plea, no push. Just the gesture of one who knows what's been set on the table, without anyone raising a voice. Rafe laid the rawhide scrap on the south entry mark, pressing one end with a finger, the borderland's way of saying yes. The wind shifted again, moving the cinnamon's warmth away, letting through the scent of earth, near baking. Far off, the windmill's pitch dropped a note as if from the grease applied that morning. On the rise, a few horses tossed their heads, white breath puffing. Seamus slung his hammer, hefted the nail sack. Miguel gathered his pack, leaving the bent lock as a reminder. The chief adjusted his reins, eyes still on the ash map. He spoke a short sentence that slid the edge off every blade near drawn. "If goodwill can ride a horse, ride with us tonight." Cole rose, brushed his hands on his jeans, eyes catching the chipped tin cup once, the memory passing like a cloud shadow over open range. He didn't hold anyone's gaze long, just nodded. On the porch the ash map lay as drawn, its lines like seep water on bare sand. In the center the braid lay by the jug, tassels in the light. Everything that needed saying had been said in acts. The rest was choosing a direction. The wind flicked someone's coat hem up, then let it fall, as if the ground itself approved the night's ride, silent, sure, and right. Part 6. When the sun slants. A test tied to the saddle horn. The sun slid down the edge of the dragoons, its light thinning like a scarf draped over the valley's shoulder. In the yard, the windmill dropped another pitch lower. Cole lifted the ash map, blew the fine dust from its surface, folded it in an old cloth, and tucked it under the saddle skirt. He gave a short nod, enough for everyone to know each had their part now. Rafe pulled back the tarp on a gear chest, drew out a well-oiled Winchester 73, levered around into the chamber, the click of steel settling like tame animal in a familiar stall. He dipped his hand in the water barrel, sliced the barrel clean of grit, wiped it dry on his shirt tail, and slipped it into its scabbard. Beside him, rawhide had been cut into short lengths, wedges for door latches, wrist ties, standing loops. Each was coiled to its right count, ends tucked, so nothing would snag in the dark. Cole unhooked his canteen, filled it from the reserve barrel, and shook it to hear the weight of water. From his pocket he took the silver concho found that morning and threaded it onto the bridle strap just below the saddle horn. One small flash like a fallen star caught in leather. Chief Yazzie stepped forward without a word, slipping from his own wrist a tasseled braid of horsehair. He looped it around Cole's saddle horn and drew the knot tight, with two calloused fingers' tassels spilling forward to brush the glossed wood. The gesture was a colorless flag. You ride as kin. Taji stood at the horse's shoulder, watching the braids sway in the wind, making certain the tie was snug enough that no hard gust would pull it loose. At the porch, Miss Lila Dawson threw open the schoolhouse wagon's doors. She spread hand-pieced quilts, set an oil lamp and a tin of cotton on the shelf, and took down a brown-covered ledger. On the first page, she wrote in dark blue ink, "Those who will stay tonight." Each name left space for a surname, just in case morning found someone who still remembered theirs. She hung a small kettle to keep water warm, laid the last of the schoolhouse biscuits in a basket, and covered it with a cloth embroidered at the corners. Every task was a stone laid over a patch of mud. A figure in a vest came to the fence and halted. Deputy Cal Webb. He took off his hat, eyes skimming away from the stairs inside the ark. The vest bulged unnaturally, as if something soft and square was hidden within. Cal's gaze flicked to the braid on Cole's saddle horn, then to the chipped tin cup on the sill. His lips moved without sound. The chief didn't look at him, only lowered a hand as though setting a pebble on water. Two riders eased aside to give Cal a path around, without stepping in. He nodded at the air, gripped his hat tight, and backed away like a man remembering the road to his own house. Rafe knelt on the porch sorting the medkit. Needles, thread, a twist of dry stove ash wrapped in cloth, a half-bottle of whiskey. He lifted each bandage roll and set it in order for his right hand. "Ain't much, but it'll hold," he told the wood. Cole slung the rifle over his shoulder, tightened the latigo until the saddle gripped the horse's shoulders. "Enough to ride." The words fell like a pebble into still water, but everyone heard them hit bottom. Taji stepped forward, facing the chipped tin cup on the sill. He looked long enough to notice the chip sat exactly where a person's lip would touch. His expression softened a notch. Not surrender, but room made for what men sometimes understand in each other. He pulled his shirt open enough to touch the carved bone bead at his chest, ran his thumb through the familiar groove, and let it fall. Nantan brought a young horse close so Nita could lay her hand on its mane in greeting. She cupped the charm bag in her palm, resting it against the animal's neck, leaving her scent for it to remember. She touched her bandage once, then let go, her eyes passing briefly over the braid on Cole's horn, the look neat and final as a silent nod. Cole checked the front shoes, prying out a small stone lodged in the frog. Rafe handed him a short hilt knife with a worn antler grip to tuck into his boot. Outside the fence, Seamus was mending a broken gate latch, his hammer falling into its familiar 3-2 rhythm. The sound eased the tightness in backs like a rub of oil. Miguel tightened his pack, leaving the bent cage locked between two boards, a reminder not to forget why this ride would be in the dark. The wind out of San Simon brought the scent of cooling mesquite. The sky bronzed, stretching the shadows of horses and men long across the yard. The chief led his own mount up to Cole's, set his palm lightly on the saddle horn again, pressing so faintly it was more seal than weight. He glanced at the water jug under the porch step, then at Cole. No one said be careful. In this country, a man ties water to his belt before he ties himself to a decision. Rafe swung into the saddle, pulled his hat low, and time latched the spurs. The click was sharp. Cole tossed him a short rawhide coil. Rafe caught it and tied it to his left flank ring. Nantan gathered his reins. The young horse rippled its hide, snorting a puff of white. Tazi raised a hand, and the riders in the ark shifted like water disturbed by a stone. No war cry, just the movement of shadows leaving their posts. From the eastern rise, Jeb Tanner peeled his horse from a gully and leaned on the fence. "If you're not back at dawn," he said low to Cole, "I'll light a fire on the rise." The words dropped like coal into cold ash, no spark, but a lingering warmth. Jeb turned his horse, stacking dry wood, testing the wind's draw, then sat, waiting. When the group turned south, the windmill's shadow slid across their backs and off the yard. The braid on Cole's horn swung with each stride, its voice inaudible in horsehair. The silver concho under the bridle caught the last scrap of sky, flashing like a promise. At the valley's edge, Jeb kindled a small tongue of flame to test the wind. It caught, glowed red. Then he capped it, saving it for dawn, if needed. That ember sat steady, a pledge hung between two banks. Go and return, and if you lose your way, the fire will show it back. Part 7. The Arroyo Road, silent tracks across sand. Evening sank into a thin bronze light, swallowing the dragoon's rim before spilling over San Simon like a blanket drawn across the basin. The horses moved out without a sound, their broken-edged shadows stretching along the fence line. The braided tassel on Cole's saddle horn swung just once, tapping wood as if sealing the promise tied there for the night. At the edge of the low ground, the arroyo opened into a white sand bed fractured with caliche, its banks cut into steps by the wind. They turned into that dry channel to let the breeze erase their sign, to bury hoofbeats beneath soft powder. The wind carried the faint, scorched scent of mesquite, smoke long since cooled. Yucca fronds scratched down their backs, leaving slim shadows like hurried handwriting in the brush. The chief led leaning forward, left hand low to his knee, cutting the air with short hand signals. Stop, lower, spread, watch left, watch right, punctuation marks in motion. No one spoke. The only metal sound came from a few silver conchos under Cole's bridle, catching the day's last light in small fires before going dark again. Rafe rode tight behind, a hand now and then brushing his mare's neck, tracing the old rockfall scar along her ribs, a brief, warm touch to remind her she wasn't alone. Nita sat behind Nantan, left hand gripping the charm pouch at her chest, thumb pressing the obsidian shard through thin hide, as if checking the smallest voice of her own heart. Wind caught the bandage on her forehead. She pulled her hood low, eyes counting the dark spaces between chaparral, the way one memorizes a room before the light goes out. A hidden rock caught the horse once. Breath and saddle swayed together, then settled again, the steady gait of bodies not yet done but determined to go far. The arroyo bent, opening to white rock ribs of an old riverbed. The chief stopped, dropped to one knee, touched two fingers to the earth, and flicked dust north. Two black shapes peeled off the rim, melting into yucca shadow. Taji, with the decoy team, swinging Wade toward the enemy cook tent. He looked up just once, eyes touching the chipped tin cup, still lodged somewhere in the memory of another man's porch, then vanished into the thicket, taking the day's bitterness with him so the night might go down smoother. The southern group, Chief, Cole, Rafe, Nantan, crawled the sand's edge, shoulders brushing thorn, shirts snagging leaves, hands untangling without sound. The rawhide coiled on a saddle let out a faint sun-dried scent. Cole swung his canteen to his left hip, freeing his shooting hand. Around a bend, the ground tilted into a washed-out lip, loose stones mottled like fish eyes. The chief paused again, nodding lightly as if pinning orders to the air. Wait for the northern signal, then slip into the back of camp, break the cage nearest the rock cut first. move the weakest out ahead. Grit lifted in the wind. Far off, one of the enemy's burrows froze, silent as stone. Then a dog in camp snorted, sniffing the air like a knife popping a canned seal. Everyone held their breath, sinking weight into saddles so the leather straps went still. Nita's grip on the pouch drew her pulse down to a single thread. Rafe hunched low, feeling along the practice latch in his pocket, measuring play, measuring pry force. Nantan looped his reins around his wrist, a tether to earth should the night suddenly break apart. They closed on Snake Creek's bed, dry this season save for ragged grass and white stones. Wind rose out of it with a damp trace, the thin breath of water. Cole caught it, felt his throat want to swallow. He brushed the saddle tassel again, reminding himself the water before words had tied into this day. In the dim, a silver concho blinked once and dropped into sand. A last bright fleck, another hand signal, move in a low arrow, crescent edge cutting the rear fence. The chief flowed ahead, body pouring over the bank like a tree's shadow stretched thin. Cole followed, circling two flat prickly pears to avoid rattling stone. Rafe left behind a stub of rawhide tucked in a rock crack, a trail sign to those who knew, disguised as a scrap lost. Nita laid a light hand over Nantan's for a moment, her unspeaking way of saying she was all right, freeing his eyes for the dark ahead. Above, a few early stars pooled, enough for those who knew the land to read slopes by the pale gleam on gravel. The arroyo bent once more, opening to level ground behind the cook tent, its fire tamped to ash, warmth heavy in the air. The chief slid like a lizard to a wagon's edge, pressing an ear to the boards to catch chain rattle human breath. 2 fingers went up, 2 cages nearest first. Cole nodded, cold sweat slick on his spine. Rafe drew out thin wooden wedges, easing one into the worn lock, so the pry would sing against wood, not metal. From the north came a short war cry, then silence, like a whip cutting dry leaves. At that beat, a lantern flared in the cook tent, swelling into a gold bloom behind canvas. North side shadows poured toward the cry, like water wind-blown. The camp dog sprang up, barked once, and forgot the direction. The chief's hand sliced the air. Go. Cole ducked low, sliding between wagon and barrel stack. Rafe hugged the dirt, laying rawhide to latch, turning slow until the play held. Nantan covered their backs, eyes sweeping the empty corners. Nita clenched the pouch, head bent slightly, breathing into the night's hum. Everything was tight, silent, exact as the charcoal sketch on plank that afternoon, only now each line had blood running under it. Within the lantern's wash, cage edges showed a grease-dark seam. Rafe counted silently, jaw set, levered. The latch hissed like a needle sliding from thread. No one breathed. North's war cry cracked again, pulling the sentry's gaze away. Cole's hand closed on a hinge, feeling the faint tremor of a sleeper's foot about to move. He looked to the chief. The nod came, and in that instant, inside the cook tent, the lamp danced higher, signal enough. The plan had crossed from thought into deed. Part 8. A small stumble. The stone's knock and the drop of water. The cook tent canvas glowed like a lamp flower, opening its eyes. The cage's seam gleamed faintly, its latch lying black and oily as a fish, disguised on the bed of a dry stream. Rafe flattened into the sand, wedging a strip of sweat-damp rawhide into the throat of the latch, turning until hide gripped iron. His breath came short, sieved through his teeth to keep from stirring dust. Cole eased around to the opposite post, palm over a wooden hinge, feeling for life inside. The chief lay low in the wagon's shadow, one hand raised, 2 fingers pinched. Wait. A patch of caliche under Cole's knee suddenly broke. The stone rolled, struck a wooden brace with a dry coke, small as a fingernail on a teacup, but in the basin's hush it rang like a grain pinging off a kettle rim. Silas Vane snapped his lantern up, its light sweeping a cold yellow arc across the canvas. In the nearest cage, a little girl jolted, a cry breaking like porcelain. The dog at the tent front pricked its ears, growled low, nose cutting the wind clean. Cole pressed flat, palm steadying the hinge. Rafe pushed the rawhide deeper, wrist turning slow, lips moving in a silent coax, like steadying a skittish horse at rope's end. The latch shifted, sighed, quieter than a swallowed cough. Nita, crouched behind the wagon wheel, drew her canteen, shook it so water touched metal, and slid to the bars. She didn't say quiet, didn't pat. Only tipped 2 drops onto the child's cracked lips, then pressed a finger to her own mouth. Drink slow. The girl stilled, as if remembering the name of something warm. She sipped, eyes wide, hiccup easing to breath. Silas's light skimmed the cook tent wall, lingered at the barrel line, then hooked on the wagon's flank. He stood half bent, lantern handle gripped like a hammer, eyes narrowed against the wind. The chief's hand fell. Rafe levered. The latch let go with a sigh, like thread sliding free of a needle. The cage shifted half an inch. Cole's fingers caught it, holding the hinge from speaking. Nita tucked the canteen into the child's hands, brushed the pouch at her chest as if to leave a heartbeat behind. North, Taji's war cry whipped the air. Sharp, brief. Firelight flared over the upper cook tent, drawing the enemy's heads like hooked fish. Silas swung his lamp toward the shout, cursing into the wind before loping off with 2 others. The dog wheeled, chain clattering just long enough for their latch click to slip unheard. The cage door opened to fit a body. Inside, Rosita Valdez lay folded, eyes closed, breathing ash cold. Cole slid halfway in, arm under her shoulders, other arm cradling her knees, lifting her like a weak calf, slow, sure, neck supported. Nantan spread a thin blanket, taking her weight as one might catch a log from the fire. The chief crouched behind, shadowing them. In the main tent, Harlan Pike tilted his head, fingers tapping the coiled bullwhip on its peg. Steady, unhurried, the beat of a man used to owning others' rhythm. He hadn't seen yet, but he smelled what didn't belong. The scent of strangers unslicked with axle grease, the faint warmth of water just rinsing iron. His hand drew the whip down a notch, holding it as if to remind himself the power sat in the swing, not the shout. Rafe wedged wood into the second hinge, tested. Inside, 3 small forms huddled. The oldest boy set a hand on his sibling's shoulders, not crying, eyes fixed on Rafe's working hand. Nita gave each 2 more drops. Same sign, finger to lips, wrist low, drink slow. One pressed a cheek to the canteen, inhaling like it was fresh bread, small enough a thing to loosen any grown throat. Gunfire beat heavier to the north, still on pattern. Taji held the swarm's anger to him like smoke-pulling bees. The chief signaled weakest out first. Nantan shouldered Rosita high on his hip, freeing his hands. Cole stepped back half a pace, shielding Nita as she eased away. Rafe cracked the second latch, a sound a hair sharper than before, like a pin brushing skin. The dog lifted its head, growled. Cole bent, flicked a pebble against a barrel across the path. The tick turned the dog's eyes a mouthful aside. The cage opened. Rafe palmed the rawhide into his hem. The oldest boy guided the others out, heads ducked to miss the iron frame. Nita tore a strip from her hem, wrapped the youngest's wrist, neat as tying a ribbon. She touched her pouch again, met the boy's eyes once, and pointed to the rock cut, only once enough. Wind corkscrewed, bringing chain rattle from deep in camp. Silas's shadow crossed the cook tent again, lamp-hunting scent. He froze, noting the damped cook fire's cover. Footsteps shifted. Harlan Pike stepped from the main tent. whip slack at his thigh, its tip scoring a thin line in the sand. He peered down the arroyo's black, lids narrowing like a man pricing the cost of a late shipment. Deputy Cal Webb stood on the rim, vest ballooned by wind, slipping once before going still, neither entering nor leaving. The chief's hand tapped Cole's shoulder. "Go!" Nantan bore Rosita toward the wash rim. Rafe scooped the smallest child, light as dry grass, holding him at the hip. Nita steadied the eldest, the canteen between them like a lamp not to be blown out. They slid from the wagon's shadow to the sand track chosen earlier, each step burying half a foot to muffle the tread. Behind them, Harlan stilled his whip, head turning at the faintest wrong note in the night's score. Another war cry slit the air, short, clean, timed like a blade, making space. Silas veered north, lamp high. Yellow light left the rear camp. Dark poured back into now where they'd been. Cole leaned to cover Nita a breath longer, then eased when her breathing steadied. Rafe stooped for a stray chip of Miguel's dried cinnamon, set it in the boy's hand, the warmth of its scent steadying his legs. Every small movement stitched the torn edge a little stronger. At the rock cut's mouth, the chief paused, counting shapes with his eyes before drawing them all into the arroyo's black. Behind them, Pike's camp met a new wind, carrying the sound of men running, wood striking, shots muffled into the low mounds. South side, where they'd passed, was left only the pebbles mark on a barrel, a faint damp at an opened cage, and a drop of water on a child's lip, now gone quiet. Things without a voice, but enough to say the night had tipped toward those who knew water before words. Part 9. Fire at Snake Creek, Blades and a Chipped Cup. By the cook tent, Taji flung a fistful of live coals into the dry straw he'd spread earlier. Fire seized the wind, crawled along the canvas edge, then flared in a bright ribbon, smoke twisting with the scent of burning mesquite. His short war cry drove the guards north like hornets smoked from a nest. Dutch Crow pretended to steady the boiling bean pot for a better look, stepped into a patch of spilled grease and slid, his head striking the rim. The hollow clang was strange. His body crumpled onto the black, greasy dirt, face buried in scorched beans and soot. No one had time to look twice. The chief slid through the shadows behind the wagons, Nantan close behind like a shadow bridging the gap. At the third cage, the lock was worn, latch gummed with axle grease. The chief wedged a bit of wood into the hinge to kill the sound, while Rafe slipped rawhide between the metal plates, twisting until he heard that thin breath of iron giving up. The latch popped, a short pull like a thread sliding from skin. Rafe kept his grip so the spring wouldn't snap. Inside, 2 women and a boy shivered like yucca leaves in the wind. Nantan reached in, fingers brushing their wrists, passing on the steady quiet of someone who knows the way out. Cole slid Rosita Valdez under a wagon, propped her shoulder with a thin blanket roll to ease her chest, half covering her in shadow. He turned back, body dropping naturally low, back flaring wide like a shield, keeping Nita out of sight from the cook tent's rising fire. In his outer pocket, he felt the chipped rim of the tin cup pressing into his rib, the one he'd stuffed in before leaving home, a reminder that water before words was the only law he meant to keep. A memory sparked, a dust-storm day, a woman at the empty chair tilting her head, setting that cup in his hand when he'd been ready to bark, whispering water first, talk after. And the anger in him had drained like dust meeting rain. His present grip tightened on the rifle stock, tight enough to let the blade meet bone later without cutting a heart. Silas Vane burst from the cook tent like a sudden squall, a lantern flung down to cast a ring of light at their feet. His knife flashed sideways, slitting the sleeve of Cole's coat, a hot line of blood welling in the cold wind. Cole didn't cry out. He shifted weight, chopped Silas's wrist with the edge of his left hand, then swung the Winchester butt backward into the man's nose. A sharp crack. The lantern rolled, flame licking the ground before the sand smothered it. Silas staggered half a step, eyes swimming, knife still twitching like a snake, unwilling to believe it had been pinned. Cole stepped in, shoulder square, blocking Nita and the open cage. Nita didn't scream. She bent to snatch a dropped revolver, thumb finding the safety without thought, lowering the muzzle, pointing at his belt line where it wouldn't kill but would plant a warning deep. The gun cracked dry once. Silas's hat brim split clean in two, flopping like a slice of night cut away. Sulfur drifted on the wind. Silas blinked hard, hands pulling back with the instinct of a man warned too close to pride. His knife dropped a notch. The chief needed no longer to look. He knew this girl beside Cole wasn't fragile. To the north, Taji's fire ate into the canvas. Dutch lay still, the blinded gunman stumbling toward the light. Rafe sprang the last latch on cage 4, his fingers trembling from the strain of holding back his breath so long. The door creaked. An old woman, thin as kindling, exhaled a thread of air. Nantan offered his shoulder without taking his eyes from the escape path. From the flats came Deputy Cal Webb, spurring hard, badge lifted like a talisman for permission. He shouted something the wind shredded. Posture pure, claimed the glory of a man late to market, trying to cut the line. Taji swept in like an arrow with a voice. He dug in his heel, his horse pivoting in the narrow gap between wagons and barrel racks. His left hand whipped up, wrist turning. Rope from the saddle painted a clean loop around Cal's wrist, snapping tight until the skin squeaked. The revolver thudded into the sand. A quick jerk, then release. Taji stepped close, disarmed him as if teaching a beginner, no wasted motion. The chief's glance was enough. Get him out of the fight so he can still face the town tomorrow. Taji signaled a rider, shoving Cal clear of the gunfire and the work decent men had to do tonight. Cal stumbled away, badge drooping, firelight glinting off its rim, reminding him it wasn't his shine to claim. Harlan Pike finally emerged from the main camp. His bullwhip a black script drawn across the sand. He measured distance with a trader's eye, fire to the north, cages open to the south, the stock leaking out. 2 of his men raised rifles, but Rafe had already shoved the last 2 children toward Nantan at the arroyo's lip. Cole stepped back half a pace, still shielding Nita, eyes on the chief and the remaining cage. Blood from his arm ran to his wrist, soaking the tin cup's rim in his pocket, chilling it. The cold dragged the memory forward and left him with a vow. Keep the water, keep the people. Words could wait for dawn. The wind shifted, blowing the fire away from the wagons. Taji barked a short, soft command, his men threading through the flames without pause. The chief pressed a hand to a freed man's chest, counting breaths, not guns. Rafe worked the last latch on the far row. A small snap and the chain dropped like a dead snake. 3 more figures herded into the arroyo. Silas stood aside, hand over his nose, eyes stinging. He saw Nita wasn't aiming at him anymore, but checking her canteen. Some nights teach a man where to stop. At the edge, Deputy Cal was handed off to a young rider for the long walk around. His face was blank as unwritten paper. The only thing he still held was the chance not to be shamed all the way. From Snake Creek's bank came the old sound of water, like a breath from far off. In the yard, Dutch still lay by the pot, the smell of burnt beans turning into the scent of a supper no one wanted. Harlan tilted his face, eyes narrowing like a ledger line. His whip traced a short word in the sand, then erased it with his heel. But the word stayed in the air. The night had turned. Cole tightened his latigo strap, switched the rifle to ease the cut, then laid his other hand briefly on Nita's shoulder, not to steady her, just to remember they stood in the same ring of light. She nodded, touched her charm bag and passed the canteen to a boy, just freed. The chief swept the ground with his gaze. Dutch down, Silas aside, Cal gone, cages open, the weak away. He exhaled short like closing a sentence, and far off, where Jeb Tanner waited on the rise, the coal in his hand must have glowed to test the wind, ready for dawn. Part 10, ending the fight with honor. Harlan Pike stood in the yard as if weighing silver, not lives. The firelight washed over his whip hand, the braided leather twitching at his side like a snake waiting to strike. Around him, the camp had gone from shouting to a hollow quiet, only the hiss of scorched canvas and the faint rattle of freed chains against wagon boards. The chief stepped into the open. His shadow, long and steady, cut the firelight in two. Nantan flanked him on the right, Cole on the left, rifle lowered but not forgotten. Behind them, the rescued stayed low in the arroyo, Taji's riders guarding each mouth of escape. The air had that sharp, metallic edge of a fight's last breath, when both sides know the outcome, but no one's ready to say it. Harlan's eyes moved from the chief to Cole, then to Nita. They lingered a second too long on the girl's charm pouch and the canteen in her hand. His whip flicked once, curling and uncurling on the ground. "You'll walk out with more than you brought," he said, his voice almost polite. The chief didn't answer. He took 3 steps closer, stopped within the length of a horsehair rope, and slowly pulled something from his belt. A single concho, old and sun-darkened, engraved with the mark of his band. He laid it on the sand between them. "You don't speak for all who rode with you," the chief said at last, "but tonight you decide if your name is counted in the breath of my people or spat into the dust." Harlan's jaw worked. His men shifted at the edges of the firelight, unsure whether to raise their rifles or drop them. Pike looked once more toward the wagons, empty now but for smoke and the stench of burnt beans. Then he crouched, picked up the concho and turned it in his hand. Something in his posture loosened, but not so much you could call it regret. "I'll count it as a trade," he muttered. The chief inclined his head once. No handshakes, no spit in the palm. Just that nod. Cole caught the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of Nita's mouth. She understood the weight of what hadn't been said. Taji stepped up, returned Pike's whip by tossing it underhand into the dirt. The gesture was clean, without mockery. Pike caught it, coiled it tight, and backed away toward the shadows where his men waited. One by one, they melted into the dark, the hoofbeats retreating toward the low hills. The chief bent, scooped a handful of sand, and let it run through his fingers over the spot where the concho had lain. Then he turned to Cole. "Saddle light," he said. "The road back is long." Cole glanced once at the pocket where the tin cup rested against his ribs, still damp with his own blood. He thought of the promise he'd made in the heat of the fight. Water before words. Always, as the riders formed up, Nita walked beside him, her stride matching his despite the night's wait. The chief rode ahead, the concho now tied to Cole's saddle, horn with a strip of rawhide, an unspoken mark that this night's work would be remembered for honor, not numbers. Somewhere beyond Snake Creek, the wind shifted again, carrying the first hint of cooler air from the high country. The fight was done, but the trail home still waited, long, quiet, and without the taste of blood in it. Part 11, the road back in the names. Blue ink ledger in the morning wind. The stone-cut wash held the column like a cupped palm of water. They slid down the arroyo, each step burying half a foot into sand to mute the bootsteps, horsetails sweeping faint streaks over the caliche floor. The chief moved in front, giving short hand signs, halt at the crumble bank, crossed to the left side, weaved past the prickly pear thickets. Nantan bore the heaviest load, keeping the weakest in the middle. Rafe shifted the smallest child from one arm to the other, chest still rising fast from the fight, but with one free hand to pat his mare's neck so she wouldn't whinny. Nita carried the canteen, offering sips as if she were measuring light itself. Slow. No one said, "We're safe now." In this country, people only open the way. On the ridge, Jeb Tanner lit the signal fire, dry mesquite cracking in its own private voice. The flame stood neat, not flaring, a single red mark for night travelers to know the bank was friendly. When he saw the column slip into the safe cut, Jeb didn't cheer. He just laid on another stick and sat back, hand cupping the wind, wearing that slightly foolish but honest look, the kind of kindness this valley survived on. At the edge of town, Miss Lila's schoolhouse wagon appeared like a lit room in a bare field. The door stood open, an oil lamp hung high. Inside, clean tables, a kettle wrapped in blankets since dusk. Miss Lila greeted each arrival, touching an elbow to help them the last few steps, then motioning them to sit. On the table, a brown-covered ledger lay open, a blue nib pen in the inkwell. She asked a name softly, nodded softly, wrote softly. Each name got a thin ribbon clipped to it, so in the morning they could find their own name again. Seamus O'Rourke crouched by the ambulance wagon's wheel, shimming the loosened rim with nails, hammering 3-2, beats that settled the ground itself. Each strike closed another ragged edge of the night. Miguel Ortega broke dry tortillas in half for the children, tapping each piece lightly into salt, so their tongues had something to cling to. One child sniffed the bread before biting, eyes closed as if recalling the smell of a kitchen. Rafe lifted an old woman onto the step, his broad hand steadying her reed-thin wrist. Once she sat, he moved off to leave the next seat free. The chief was still counting breaths. He stood behind those who'd finished giving their names, one hand resting lightly on a shoulder, feeling the rise and fall even out, then moved to the next. Cole set the chipped tin cup under the kettle's spout, poured warm water, turning the chipped edge outward so lips wouldn't scrape, one small motion that lit the hallway half again. Nita eased the canteen into Rosita Valdez's hand, set the young mother's elbow to the table edge, tilting the neck so the stream found its mark. Miss Lila bowed over the ledger. The first name she wrote was Rosita, her nib trembling one stroke past the R, steadying by the A. Some didn't recall their surname. She marked a dash, tied on a paler ribbon, and whispered, "We'll ask again tomorrow." The words no louder than the percolator's sigh from the camp stove. Miguel leaned in the doorway, broke cinnamon sticks in his pocket, dropped shards into the kettle so warmth spread through the wagon. Seamus shot to the elbow, set the hammer down on the straw mat, then tucked his bag of nails into the corner where he kept it when shoeing the school's mare. Outside, the San Simon wind changed tone, carrying sagebrush scent tangled with sweat and old iron. Nantan pulled the tarp down to block the front row from the breeze. Rafe brought out a flour sack to prop under a young woman's feet. The chief's glance caught on Cole's saddle horn, where the newly gifted concho sat like a pinned drop of starlight. His eyes lingered just long enough to say what needed saying about their bargain. Up on the ridge, Jeb kept the torch lowered so the flame wouldn't mock the night just past. When Miss Lila tied the last ribbon, he buried the fire in ash, leaving ember dust like salt scattered on earth. No shouts followed. Folks just stepped aside for one another. A hand passed the water cup to the next hand, water before words, a thin but lasting thread. In the shadows by the schoolhouse, Deputy Cal Webb stood a long while. He held his badge tight, face creased like paper too crumpled to smooth again. When Miss Lila shut the ledger, Cal cut down the main street, the sheriff's office dark as an empty wood box. He opened the door, the hinge giving a wrong note, and set the badge on the desk in a square of moonlight. No paper under it, no line of explanation. Cal pulled a chair as if for someone else to sit, then turned his back and walked out of town. No one called after him. The wind pressed his vest once, like a breath, then let go. Inside the schoolhouse wagon, Miss Lila tied the last ribbon on a name missing its surname, closed the book, laid it near the lamp to dry. Seamus stilled his hammer. Miguel wrapped the leftover tortillas. Rafe drew the blanket to the old woman's chin. Nita gathered the canteens, found one with a finger's worth of water. Cole set the chipped cup beside the kettle. Chip turned toward the stove. The chief stepped onto the porch, looking toward San Simon Valley, where the road back to Cole's ranch cut through yucca and chaparral like a vein hidden in earth. He touched the wagon's post, a touch that told the wood it was counted on. Then he turned, nodded once to Cole, a signal for the next leg. Far off, the wind stacked the night's stray sounds. Hammer 3-2, ledger closed, embers sighing, into a quiet just strong enough to carry them to the covenant of land. Part 12. Covenant of the Land. Horsehair strip on the fence post. Evening poured copper into the basin, dragoon shadows stretching like a long hand across San Simon. The wind changed voice, sagebrush scent sliding over the fence, carrying caliche dust fine as ash. Cole's yard lay still, windmill turning slower now, the rasp lower after a long night. He hung the reins on the hook, fingers brushing the new silver concho, cool as a trapped star. On the sill, the chipped tin cup sat where it always did. Chip turned toward the stove like every morning, now catching the red last light through a bowing yucca stalk. A small hoofbeat on the road. Chief Yazzie came without the retinue, just him and Nita. They stopped far enough from the porch for the ground to see their faces. Cole stepped out, set the water jug on the step, and turned toward the guests. Nita's hand touched her charm pouch, brushing the bandage at her brow as if to let the wind pass. The chief bowed his head, lifted the jug, drank one swallow, set it back exactly in place, like returning something to its birthplace. He looped his reins over the fence post, then drew from his deerskin pocket a braided strip of horsehair. He smoothed it once, the tassel shining faint with the sweat of the road, then hung it high on the post so the fringe touched the wood. It swayed in the wind like a thread, stitching the sky to the post that had held this ground through many droughts. His palm pressed the post once, knucklebone against grain sounding like a pebble rolling in an old stream bed. In his land, a safe ground sign had to be seen and touched. From now on, any who passed would lay rifles flat, muzzles turned inward. No proclamation needed. The horsehair strip would speak a longer sentence. Cole looked past the doorframe to where his own rifle had sat the same way since that first morning, and nodded just enough for the wood to know it had been promised something more. Taji arrived half a beat later, stopping at the porch in the silence of a perimeter man. His gaze slid to the chipped cup. The broken edge caught a red glint, like the nick on an old moon. His look softened a shade, mouth folding into a crease, not quite a smile. No one named the feeling. Last night had taught them to leave things where they belonged. Nita lifted the jug, poured a little water into the chipped cup, pushing it toward Cole ahead of any word. He accepted, the warmth of the water touching his tongue like a slow greeting. She drew a chair forward on the porch, set her hand on the backrest where Cole had once slept beside her bed, a light touch long enough for a father to understand what that chair meant. The chief glanced at the chair, then at the jug. He said a short line, voice thick with wind, just enough to be heard. Water that day, people today, balanced. Nothing more. Nantan came with the wind from behind the barn, shoulders dust-tired. He put the young colt in the stall, loosed the halter, glanced up at the windmill. On the porch, Cole held up a small wrench. Without a word, they climbed to the platform together. Nantan held the blade. Cole worked the bolt, adding grease to the bearing. The vanes spun once, the rasp shifting to a lower, rounder voice. That sound eased the tightness in their backs, like an old hand with oil on the joints. The chief watched in silence, head turned toward the windmill, as if listening for whether this new water song was gentle enough to guide tomorrow through the valley. Nita touched the horsehair braid, not taking it down, just letting the fringe slide past her fingers, testing the strength of a promise. She turned back, set the chipped cup close to the jug, chipped toward the stove, another small act to spare the next drinker's lips. On the table, Cole laid the whittling knife beside the concho, small, bright things trembling in the low sun, like coins in a quiet bank, one that dealt in little acts of decency. The wind pushed dust across the yard, yucca bowing deeper. Birds lit on the fence, then lifted off again, testing the line's give. Taji tipped his hat, brushed a strip of dust from the brim, set it on the fence post beside the horsehair braid, then lifted it off. A gesture like a nod between a traveler and a homestead. His eyes drifted to Cole's saddle horn, seeing yesterday's loop of braid still tied there. The horsehair darkened with sweat, beautiful in the way something is when used exactly for what it was meant. Miss Lila didn't come. The schoolhouse still held sleepers, but the lamp warmth from there seemed to ride the wind across, tangled with the cinnamon scent still in the cup. Miguel was surely tidying his pack. Seamus no doubt struck the last beats on an axle, every one of those rhythms pooling into the quiet under this sunset. The chief set 2 fingers on the porch rail, straightening a loose nail. A small act like a guarantee the house now had another hand to set what was crooked. Cole held the jug for the chief. He drank, passed it to Nita, then set it back exactly in its patch of sunlight, keeping the water steady as one keeps the heart steady. His hand touched the fence post again, ear pressed to the grain, a habit of those who live long with wood, always wanting to hear what's inside. Then he stepped back. Taji, leaning on the saddle, tilted his head as if hearing a faint sound no one else could. No danger, only the wind bringing the first damp breath of the next night. Nantan dropped from the platform, wiped grease on his pants, and handed the wrench back. He didn't say done. Cole just brushed a bit of dust from his shoulder, rolled his sleeve down to hide the stitched cut so last night's blood wouldn't show. Nita saw, but didn't reach. She eased her chair back, clearing the way for the chief to step into the porch shade. Taji, at the edge of the boards, glanced once more at the chipped cup. This time, his mouth lifted enough to shape half a smile, not for the cup, but for whoever had turned the chip toward the stove. The windmill spun steady, kitchen hum starting up. The kettle Cole had set on earlier was getting to work. On the fence post, the horsehair braid swayed. In this land, people fixed packs to things that could endure, horsehair that could take sweat, sun, and a season's hard wind. It told the chief's people that here they'd lay their guns flat before calling out. It told the ground the house had chosen to stand for water before words. The chief tightened his reins, eyes sweeping the yard, the door, the cup, the windmill. He gave one short nod, a period at the end of the day's sentence. Nita touched the braid once more, then offered the jug to Cole, completing the morning's ritual. He drank, set it down, and left the rest for the wind. Somewhere in the pasture, a cowbell chimed, like glass beads tapping in a child's hand. Enough to know tomorrow would still need tending. When the chief and Taji turned their horses, the braid flickered in rhythm with their gait. Nantan stayed a few beats longer, helping Cole lift the tank lid, hearing the waters slap inside. "Full," Cole said, nothing more. They shut the door, laying the sunset flat across the kitchen table. The kettle began its low drone. Steam eased the lid upward, Wind drifted through the porch, lifting the cinnamon scent to brush the chipped cup. On the fence, the horsehair braid sat in its new place, a thin but lasting line like a palm crease. Everyone here now knew how to follow if ever they needed to find their way back to safe ground. Parpui. Part 13. The braided loop and the chipped tin cup, two things keeping each other warm. Evening wind sifted through the yucca, carrying the scent of caliche earth cooling after sun. On the sill, the chipped tin cup caught a band of deep red light, its broken lip turned toward the stove as always. Nita stepped up, her hands still scented faintly of cinnamon ash. One fingertip brushed the chip as if touching an old scar. She looked at Cole for a long moment, her voice low enough for the wood alone to hear. "This stays?" Cole nodded, the kind of nod from a man who had just regained a voice that needed no words. She slipped the horsehair braid from her wrist, a strand soaked with the sweat of long miles, its tassel dark as evening clouds over water. Nita looped it through the cup's handle, cinched it neatly, and let the tassel rest against the chip. Horsehair touched tin with the faintest click, a sound so small it felt like two strangers finding a way to lean into each other. Then there are two keeping each other warm. Her words dropped onto the porch like a pebble into a well, circles spreading and then stilling quickly. At the water trough, Rafe led up the mare, his hand brushing an old scar on her neck. The animal lowered her muzzle, drinking slowly as if she'd learned manners. Rafe bent to draw two more buckets, rinsed arroyo dust from his hands, then knelt by the gate latch, shimming its loose fit with a sliver of wood he'd carried in his leather pouch. No complaint, just the cleaner tone of metal settling into place. He set two filled canteens on the step, tipped his hat back a notch, and glanced toward the cup with its new braid. The corner of his eye wrinkled as though he'd just heard a greeting landright. Seamus O'Rourke arrived like a hammer's shadow, coat still smelling of soot, a bag of forge nails slung over one shoulder. He set the bundle on the table, opening it to reveal a palmful of straw-colored nails, square heads, tapering shanks, the kind he used when a horse's shoes wore thin. "Leave it here," he said lower than the windmill's hum, then tapped 3 to 2 along the porch post with the flat of his hammer. The rhythm straightened a man's back like a bowstring pulled true. He stepped back, checked the outer door hinge, and tightened it a half-turn, like mending a loose stitch in a cuff. Miss Lila appeared on the sand edge, a brown ledger hugged close. She set it on the table, flipped to a fresh page, laid a blue ink pen in the groove. No speeches, she slid it toward Cole, pointing to the blank beneath the line, "Temporary Patron." Cole wiped his fingers on his shirt hem and signed, like driving a new stake into ground. Rafe signed under him for the two children, his letters straight and dry. Miguel came by, marking beside Rosita, as if clearing a path to speak her full name tomorrow, each mark pressed into the paper like a knot tying the living back to each other. On the sill, the chipped cup now wore its braid. Horsehair swayed with the new oiled tone of the windmill. The silver concho on Cole's reins caught the last scrap of sky, flashing once before winking out. Nita set her medicine pouch beside the cup, leaning the black obsidian against its side so the stone cast a cool stripe across the chip. She took a seat on the bench's edge, where someone else had once sat, but kept a respectful gap, like a guest waiting to be invited nearer to the fire. At the yard's far side, Chief Yazzie was mounted, reins loose, his horse standing into the wind. He turned when he saw the braid on the cup. His gaze held a moment, deep as a wash cut after the flood. "The wind remembers its way," he said, leaving the words there, smooth and round as a river stone, before turning toward the fence post where another horsehair strip fluttered. His hand brushed the tassel as if signing his own name. Cole lifted the water jug, poured into the chipped cup until steam rose thin and carried it toward the porch. He glanced out over the darkening field and spoke in the unpushed way of local invitations. Winds turned. Stop in for a drink. No one rushed. Miss Lila's hand gestured Nita first. Seamus stepped aside for the wind to pass. Rafe nudged the canteen closer to those riding out again. The invitation became the way people stood half a step nearer. Nita took the cup, turned the chip toward the stove as she'd seen Cole do 100 times and sipped small. She set it back exactly, letting the braid's tassel rest against a last sliver of sun on the wood. Her palm opened, fingers spread, laying lightly on the table, a sign she'd spent one night here and meant to return. Cole said neither stay nor go. He adjusted the latch, shifted the saddle rack aside, clearing a space just right for a pair of boots to wait out a wind. Beyond the fence, yucca bent their heads, casting long shadows over the horsehair. Hung at dawn, its tassel caught the fading sky, looking like a thin stream running over wood. The chief turned his horse half round, scanning the porch one last time. Chipped cup with braid, water jug, concho, open ledger, all small and equal in meaning. He touched heels. The horse moved. On the table, Miss Lila tied a short ribbon to the signed page's edge, tucking half into the spine so tomorrow she'd find the line in one pull. Seamus slid the nail packet beside the post under the porch eave where dew wouldn't find it. He tapped 3 to 2 on his hammer again. The blacksmiths leave it here. Rafe hung the canteen, wiped the trough's lip with his broad hand until the wood shone like oiled hide. Cole leaned against the post, eyes passing from the chip to the braid. The image of the woman from before rose and fell like cloud shadow. The feeling of staying was warm now, no longer sharp. He touched his hat brim to the cup, salute to the old and new both. Nita saw, her smile small, just enough to stir the pouch against her chest. From the low meadow came the steady clank of cattle bells marking time through the last light. The sound strung together the porch's small doings. Braid on chipped cup, ribbon in ledger, nails in weight. Canteen hung, water kept warm. Enough to know tomorrow would need people here. And any wind that crossed this porch would be met with a cup before a word. Part 14. 2 cups, still warm, water before words, chair no longer empty. Sunset spilled red over the yucca, the dragoon's rim darkening like ink on old paper. The windmill turned slow, its wine rounded by fresh oil. In the kitchen, the percolator bubbled, its glass lid nodding. Cole tipped the pot, filling 2 cups, one wide-mouthed mug, one chipped tin with a horsehair braid at its handle. He set the first before the chair by the door. Today, that chair was no longer empty. Rafe stepped up the porch, arroyo dust still on his coat, setting his canteen down, giving the latch he'd shimmed earlier, a quiet press so the wind wouldn't whistle. Miss Lila followed, ledger hugged tight, its ribbon peeking like a leftover sunbeam. Nita paused at the threshold, hand on her medicine pouch, fingers brushing the braid tassel like greeting a new friend. On the fence, the horsehair strip chief had tied that morning breathed in the wind, its tassel tapping wood like a heartbeat. Cole slid the water jug to the porch center before anyone spoke. Miss Lila poured a mouthful into a small cup, pressing it into Nita's hand. She drank slowly, turning the chip toward the stove by habit. Rafe took the jug, drank short, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, set it back in the circle of light. Water first, words after. No loud thanks, just warmth on the cup's rim and the percolator's steady popping. Out in the yard, cattle bells chimed from the low meadow. Somewhere, Seamus's hammer rhythm of 3 to 2 faded into the evening. Miguel's cinnamon scent lingered at the wind's nape. On the far edge, Jeb Tanner's mound lay cool and flat, its last smoke ring like a promise kept. Nantan passed by the barn, plucked a small nail from his boot heel, and clipped it to the fence. A scrap relic of a night when more hands than guns made the difference. Miss Lila opened her ledger, resting the pen on the table's edge. She didn't read the names, only smoothed the ribbon over the temporary patron page. Rafe pulled out a chair, half sitting, hat on his knee. Nita took the seat near the door, back straight. The chipped cup in her hands, braid wrapped snug, medicine pouch leaning against its side. Cole stood by the post, eyes moving from stove to chip to horsehair, small things speaking for bigger truths. The wind shifted, sagebrush scent spilling into the porch, mingling with strong coffee. Cole refilled the chipped cup, steam curling around the braid like creek mist over rock. Memory of the old woman surfaced, not sharp now, just a pale figure handing him the chipped cup on a dust-storm day, saying, "Water first, words later." That shadow now blended with Nita turning the cup to hide its break, with Miss Lila tilting the ledger, with Rafe's fingers tapping the latch, each gesture fluent in the language of hands. A raven tilted over the roof, leaving a single crook behind. The windmill's hum evened, the pot's hiss deepened. Cole poured for Rafe, nudged it across, poured for Miss Lila, set it by her book, set the chipped cup before Nita again, each cup shifting a little, like rocks eased so water could flow. Nita took it, holding the handle where the braid was warm. Miss Lila put down her pen, arms around the ledger, as if holding a basket of settled names. Rafe exhaled, eyes flicking to the horsehair on the post, the quick glance of a man certain the fence now had its keeper. Night gathered softly. The first star lit the concho on Cole's saddle, flared and went dark. Far off, the San Simen murmured in its channel, sending up damp air from Snake Creek. Cole lifted the jug, turning its handle toward the others. A habit sunk deep. Nita set her pouch beside the chipped cup, letting the obsidian touch tin mountain, stone and metal borrowing each other's heat. Miss Lila closed the ledger halfway, ribbon caught in the paper like a thin stream through a sandbank. Rafe hung his canteen, fingers drumming a quiet beat on its strap. No one pushed the talk loud. They spoke by sliding chairs, nudging cups, turning the chip outward, laying rifles flat on the rail, as promised. The horsehair strip on the fence swayed steadily. Each tassel was a period on the rule for coming days. Our people passed with guns down first. On the stove, the percolator stilled, its lid settled. Cole poured the last drops for both cups, his hand no longer shaking from last night. He looked around, chair filled, jug centered, chipped cup with braid, ledger warm under lamplight, latch snug, concho catching starlight, horsehair signing the wind. The kind of steady he'd once thought lived only in old photographs, now sat on his porch, built from the small work of many hands. He nodded, not to anyone, but to the ground. A light gust crossed, steam lifting thin as feather down. Nita raised the chipped cup, took the last sip, set it back just so. Miss Lila reopened the ledger a finger's width, smoothed the ribbon flat. Rafe circled the yard, tested the latch once more, returned, and drew his chair in tight, as if promising tomorrow night the seat would be taken again. "No thanks," spoken aloud. "Only percolator, windmill, cattle bells." "And 2 cups are still warm. Have you ever seen someone give water before words, and watched it change another's whole day? Tell me about one." When the San Simen wind softened its voice, the windmill turned steady, like the heartbeat of a house. On the windowsill, the chipped tin cup wrapped in horsehair braid was still warm. The concho beneath the saddle strings caught a single star, then let it fade. The horsehair strip on the fence post quivered, a quiet reminder that the packed water before words still stood, silent but unshaken. The names in the blue ink ledger had dried. Seamus's 3-2 hammer rhythm had gone still. Miguel's cinnamon scent lingered, and Jeb's signal fire slept under ash. Cole poured another mouthful, slid the water jug to the middle of the porch. Rafe eased his chair closer. Nita set her medicine pouch beside the cup. No one spoke loudly. The land understood. If you've come with us this far, I'd like to hear one small thing. In the day just past, have you ever set water before words for someone? Or had someone do it for you? Just one line, a moment warm enough. Who knows, from those few drops, someone's empty chair might find a person to sit beside it again.